My name is Savannah. I'm 32. And last year, I walked into my parents' house after a 16-hour shift, only to find the place completely empty. No note, no message, just a voicemail saying they didn't need me anymore. I was working 4 jobs to pay their debts while they secretly planned to disappear with lottery winnings. Where are you watching from? Subscribe for more real stories about family drama, emotional courage, and finding strength after betrayal. I still remember the weight of that night in my bones. Even now, months later, some evenings feel the same, cold, heavy, and too quiet, like the air itself is holding its breath. That night started like any other long day in my stretched-thin life. Back then, I was juggling 4 jobs to help my parents get out of the financial mess they had been drowning in for years. I wasn't living, I was just surviving hour to hour, cleaning offices before sunrise, working the daycare through the afternoon, waitressing through dinner, and stocking shelves until midnight. By the time I finally clocked out from the grocery store, my legs felt like they were full of wet sand. My hands shook from exhaustion, and I kept telling myself I just needed to make it home, eat whatever leftovers were in the fridge, and get 4 hours of sleep before starting all over again. That was my life. Simple, predictable, and painfully draining, but it was what I believed I needed to do to help my parents. They were my responsibility, or at least that's what I told myself. The drive home was quiet, almost too quiet. There was usually some sort of background noise, an old country song on the radio, a passing car, or even my own humming to keep myself awake. But that night, nothing felt normal. I kept noticing tiny things. The empty streets, the way my headlights seemed dimmer than usual, how the dashboard clock looked blurry even though I wasn't crying yet. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, I noticed something instantly. The porch light was off. My parents never turned that light off. My mom was afraid someone might trip or think we weren't home. I sat in my car a moment, staring at the dark front door, thinking maybe they fell asleep early, or maybe the bulb just burned out. I shook the thought off, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the door, forcing myself to breathe, normally even as uneasiness spread through my chest. The moment I stepped onto the porch, something felt different. It wasn't just the dark window or the silence. It was the stillness. It was the kind of stillness that settles after something has already happened, something irreversible. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. Within seconds, my world shifted. The house was empty. Not messy empty. Not, we're rearranging furniture. Empty, but stripped. Hollow. Abandoned. The couch was gone. The rug was gone. The pictures that always hung on the hallway wall, the family vacations, my school photos, the picture of Mom and me baking cookies when I was 6, they were all gone. I stepped inside, slowly, not believing what I was seeing. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and for a moment, I wondered if someone had broken in. Maybe they cleaned out the place in a hurry. Maybe, but even that thought didn't sit right. No burglar packs up your entire life neatly and leaves the floors clean behind them. Mom? Dad? I called out, but my voice felt small in the emptiness, swallowed by the walls. I walked farther in. The kitchen cabinets were open and empty. The magnets were stripped off the fridge. Even the old ceramic sugar jar my mom loved, a little chipped bunny with long ears, was gone. That jar had been on the counter every day of my life. Seeing that empty space hit so hard it felt physical. The only light in the whole house came from my phone screen as I tried turning on the kitchen switch. Nothing. Power still worked, but the bulbs were missing. I don't know why, but my instinct was to walk into my old bedroom, even though I hadn't lived there in years. Maybe I thought I'd find some sign that things were okay, some piece of me still left behind. But when I opened the door, all I found was a bare mattress on the floor and a single envelope sitting right in the middle. The envelope had my name on it, just Savannah, in my mother's handwriting. My stomach twisted. I stared at that envelope for a long time. Picking it up felt like lifting 1,000 pounds. My fingers shook as I opened it. I expected a letter, a message, some kind of explanation. Instead, it was empty. No money, no note, no apology, just a blank sheet of paper. I remember whispering, "What is this supposed to mean?" as if the walls would answer me. And then my phone buzzed. A voicemail from my mom. I pressed it to my ear, and I'll never forget the coldness in her voice. She sounded almost relieved. "Savannah, we're leaving. We don't need you anymore. Don't contact us." That was it. No thank you. No explanation. No goodbye. It felt like someone had pressed pause on the world. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't swallow. I just stood there, listening to the silence after her words. I sat down on the bare mattress because my legs wouldn't hold me anymore. My vision blurred, and I realized I was crying even though I hadn't felt the tears start. I worked 4 jobs. I paid off medical bills, credit card balances, overdue taxes, anything they needed. I skipped meals. I skipped birthdays. I skipped living, all to help them. And with one lottery ticket, they vanished. I didn't know about the winnings yet. Not then. All I knew was that they were gone. And the people I loved most in the world didn't think I deserved so much as a goodbye. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there in that empty room, staring at the walls that had once held posters and memories. I kept thinking, maybe this was a mistake. Maybe they were upset and needed space. Maybe they were playing some kind of twisted joke. I kept replaying every fight we'd ever had, every moment that might have pushed them away. But nothing made sense. Eventually, I forced myself up. My throat felt tight, my chest heavy. I walked around the house slowly, touching the empty spaces where my parents' lives used to be. Every corner brought back memories, and every memory hurt more than the last. In the kitchen, I noticed something odd, a stack of torn papers near the trash can. When I bent down to look closer, I realized they were old bills, ones I had paid. Medical statements, loan notices, late fees. They had torn them up before leaving, as if erasing the past erased everything I did for them. That hurt more than anything. It wasn't just that they left. They wanted every trace of my sacrifice wiped clean. I remember standing there, gripping the counter, trying to steady my breathing. I wasn't angry yet, not truly. Mostly I was in shock. The kind that makes everything feel distant and unreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart instead of my own. When I finally walked back outside, the night air felt colder than I remembered. The sky looked too clear, too quiet, as if the universe was pretending nothing had happened. I stood in the driveway, staring at the dark windows, realizing I didn't have a home anymore. I didn't have answers. I didn't even have my parents. And the worst part, I had absolutely no idea why. Not yet. Not until the next morning. Not until the truth spread around town like wildfire. Not until strangers began looking at me like I was the villain. But that comes later. Tonight was the night everything fell apart. Tonight was the night I learned what betrayal truly felt like. Tonight was the night that led me to the billionaire. But I didn't know any of that yet. All I knew was the silence, the emptiness, and the cold truth that my world had changed forever. The next morning, I woke up on the couch at a friend's house, Tommy's, because I couldn't face my empty home again. The sunlight poured through the blinds and made the room feel almost too bright, like it was exposing every ache I hadn't wanted anyone to see. My body ached, but it wasn't just from exhaustion. It was the weight of uncertainty, the heaviness of knowing the people I trusted most had walked away without a backward glance. I tried to focus on something else. Anything else, but my phone kept buzzing in my pocket. Each notification made my stomach drop. Texts, missed calls, social media alerts. It all pointed to the same thing. My parents' lottery win was now public knowledge, and the town had an opinion. I hadn't expected it to hit me like this. I thought betrayal was private, a silent wound you carried in your chest. I thought people who knew me would see the truth. But as soon as news spread, it was as if the world had turned a collective finger against me. The first sign came when I went to the local grocery store to grab something for breakfast. I hadn't been back since the previous night. As soon as I stepped inside, a hush fell over the store. Familiar faces glanced at me sideways, whispering, their eyes darting nervously. The cashier, who had always greeted me with a smile, barely looked up as she scanned my items. A neighbor I had grown up with, Mrs. Callahan, murmured something about shame under her breath, and I froze. I wanted to run out. I wanted to explain, to scream, to tell them the truth, that I had spent years working myself to the bone for my parents, covering bills they hadn't asked me to pay, sacrificing sleep, social life, and even my own dreams. But the words lodged in my throat. No one would hear me. The story had already been rewritten, and in this small town, perception was everything. I left the groceries on the counter and walked out, my hands trembling and my chest tight. The air outside felt heavier than usual. Every step toward home, or rather toward what was supposed to be my home, felt like walking through a storm. People were already starting to whisper about me before I even got close. By the time I reached the corner near my old house, I could see a small crowd of neighbors gathered, murmuring and pointing at the empty lot. They had seen the moving truck, or maybe heard from my parents' friends who were in on the secret. One of the teenagers from my high school, Josh, even yelled, "Guess she couldn't hold them down anymore." I froze. My face flushed, not from the heat, but from a cocktail of humiliation and anger. I wanted to run, to scream, to throw something, anything. But instead, I did what I had learned to do after years of exhaustion. I walked faster, my shoulders hunched, my mind numb. I avoided eye contact, kept my head down, and prayed they wouldn't follow me. Back at Tommy's, I locked myself in the spare room and sat on the bed, staring at the blank wall. I could hear his mom moving around in the kitchen, making pancakes, humming a tune I had heard 100 times before. The smell of syrup and bacon should have been comforting, but instead it made me feel even more out of place, like a ghost sitting among the living. Tommy knocked softly on the door. "Savannah, you okay?" he asked, his voice careful. I could hear concern, but also hesitation. The news had reached him too. He knew what the town thought, and maybe he was afraid it would rub off on him. "I'll be fine," I mumbled, not wanting to cry again. I wasn't ready for anyone to see that version of me. Not yet. But the truth is, I wasn't fine. And I wasn't just facing empty streets and whispered judgments. I was facing a town that had rewritten my story without asking me a single question. Overnight, I had gone from being the daughter who sacrificed everything for her family to the daughter who abandoned herself, at least according to everyone else. I spent the next few days trying to keep my life moving, but it was impossible. Every errand, every trip, every interaction reminded me that my name carried a different weight now. People stared when I walked down Main Street. I overheard fragments of conversations in the coffee shop. She didn't deserve it anyway. I heard she was selfish, poor kids these days, always expecting something for nothing. It was like living inside a bubble of judgment, and I couldn't escape. Even at work, the change was subtle but sharp. My manager at the diner, someone I had known for years, started assigning me the toughest shifts, usually the late-night closing hours with the rude customers who thought they could vent their frustrations on anyone. The delivery route I used to love was suddenly the most grueling one, and my coworkers, normally my friends, kept their distance. I could feel the silent blame weighing on me. One evening, I was stocking shelves at the grocery store when Mr. Jensen, a regular customer, walked up. He'd known me since I was a teenager, and I thought maybe he'd see the truth in my tired eyes. Instead, he gave a tight-lipped smile. "Hope you're handling everything okay. You know, the family thing," he said. I nodded, trying not to cry, but inside, every word felt like salt on an open wound. I wanted to say, "You don't know a thing about it," but I swallowed it. No one would believe me. They were invested in the story my parents had spun. It didn't stop there. Flyers for a local fundraiser appeared in the library and post office, celebrating my parents' win and their new home, complete with lavish photos. My name was absent, erased. All those years of labor, all the times I had picked up extra shifts to keep the lights on and bills paid, it was as if I had never existed. I remember one day walking into the post office to mail a package for a friend. Mrs. Green, the clerk who had always smiled at me, gave me a look I would never forget. It was the kind of look that measured not just who you were, but whether you belonged. And in that moment, I didn't. I left the post office with my head down, clutching the envelope as if it could anchor me to reality. The wind was cold, nipping at my cheeks, but I didn't notice. My mind replayed every interaction from the past 2 days, every whispered insult, every pointed glance, every friendly comment that carried hidden judgment. I started avoiding the usual places I used to go, the park where I walked the dogs, the diner where I met friends, even the library where I studied in college. Each familiar location felt like it was now contaminated with scrutiny, a reminder that my reputation was tarnished. Even my friends' reactions were complicated. Some of them didn't know what to believe, and they tiptoed around me like I might break if touched the wrong way. Others, when pressed, admitted that they'd heard stories from my parents and weren't sure what to think. That uncertainty felt worse than outright judgment. At least with outright judgment, I could fight back or walk away. Uncertainty left me trapped in my own mind, constantly questioning if I had done something wrong. I started keeping a notebook, writing down what really happened, trying to make sense of it all. I wrote about working double shifts, about helping pay for medical procedures, about the nights I skipped dinner so my parents could eat, about the time I stayed up all night to fix a tax mistake they didn't even notice. Writing it down helped a little, but the words felt meaningless when no one else could read them. One night, as I was writing, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, but answered. "Savannah," a voice said, calm and deliberate. "I think we need to talk." It was a man I had never met, but he knew details about my situation. Small, precise details that only someone paying attention could know. He didn't offer help immediately, but the call shook me. Maybe someone finally saw me, really saw me. Days turned into a week, and the whispers continued. The local grocery store had a lottery winner sign up in the window with my parents' names. And every time I walked past, someone would say, "Hope she's okay," or "Maybe she'll finally leave town." The last part stung more than any direct insult. Leave town? Where could I go? I had no one else, no money, no home. I was stuck in a place that had rewritten my story and refused to acknowledge the truth. Even the small comforts became poisoned. My favorite coffee shop had my usual cup ready one morning, but the barista's smile was forced, eyes shifting to see if anyone noticed me. I wanted to scream that I hadn't asked for attention. I just wanted acknowledgement that I existed, that my sacrifices mattered. It wasn't just the strangers. My cousin, who lived a few blocks away, came over one evening and asked why I hadn't left town like everyone else expected. "Savannah, maybe it's time to let this go," she said, sipping her tea. Her words were gentle, but they cut deeper than anything else. She wasn't being mean. She was reflecting what everyone else seemed to think. My presence alone had become inconvenient. a reminder of a story people preferred not to know. By the second week, I started noticing small, cruel reminders around town. A car that used to follow me home from work suddenly slowed down whenever I walked by. A neighbor would wave in passing, then roll their eyes as soon as I turned away. Even the dogs I used to pet on my walks seemed to sense something wrong. They growled when I approached. The emotional toll was relentless. Nights became longer than days. I would sit in the dark of Tommy's spare room, listening to the hum of the fridge, thinking about how small and insignificant I must have seemed to the world. Every day felt like proving I still belonged, though I had no idea how or to whom. And yet, despite all this, I kept moving forward. I went to work. I answered texts. I nodded when people spoke. I smiled when I had to, because what else could I do? I didn't have the luxury of collapsing completely, not while bills, rent, and my own survival were still at stake. By the end of the second week, I realized the town had made its judgment, and it wasn't going to change anytime soon. But within that realization, a strange clarity began to form. If no one else believed in me, I had to believe in myself. If everyone else had rewritten my story, then it was up to me to reclaim it. And so I started small. I cleaned my room at Tommy's house, organized my notebook of truths, and made a plan, not for revenge, not yet, but for survival. The town could whisper, gossip, and judge all it wanted. I would continue to work, continue to show up, and eventually I would find the people who mattered, those who would see me for who I truly was. The town had turned its back on me, but I refused to turn my back on myself. The morning after I resolved in my own mind that I had to keep moving forward, I woke with a deep ache in my bones. My body felt like it had been running on fumes for months, but I pushed myself out of Tommy's spare room anyway. There was no other option. No one was going to fight for me. No one was going to hand me a lifeline. Every dollar I earned, every hour I worked, was all I had to survive. I pulled on the same worn jeans and a threadbare hoodie I had been living in for weeks. My hair had grown out messy, streaks of gray dusting my roots from stress and sleepless nights. I didn't bother looking in the mirror. I didn't need to. I had already become a stranger to myself, a face lined with exhaustion and quiet determination. The first job of the day was at the diner, where I had worked for the past 3 years. I arrived just as the morning shift began, and already the place smelled of burnt toast, frying bacon, and bitter coffee. The hum of the griddle, the chatter of waitstaff, the clink of plates. It should have been comforting, like a familiar rhythm. But today, it felt like a warning. I pulled on my apron and forced a smile at the manager, Mr. Harlan, who was busy arguing with a delivery driver about missing supplies. "Morning, Savannah," he muttered, not looking up. There was something in his tone I hadn't noticed before, a subtle weariness and tension, like he knew about the gossip circling town, but didn't want to address it. I nodded and got to work, juggling orders, refilling coffee cups, and wiping down tables in a blur of motion. By the time the breakfast rush slowed, my body was trembling. My stomach had been empty since dawn, but I didn't dare sit. There was no time, no room for rest. I grabbed a granola bar from my bag and chewed mechanically, tasting nothing, feeling nothing, and went straight to the daycare job. The daycare was always chaos. Children running, crying, screaming for snacks or attention. Normally, I could find a rhythm with them, a small sense of accomplishment in shaping tiny minds and watching laughter bloom. But today I couldn't connect. Every giggle, every tug on my sleeve felt like a sharp reminder that my own childhood, my own stability, had been ripped from me. The kids asked questions. "Why is your face sad? Where's your family?" I smiled, murmured something about being tired, and moved on, but the questions lingered like invisible hands squeezing my chest. By the time the daycare shift ended, my feet were swollen, my shoulders slumped, and my brain buzzed with exhaustion. I didn't go home. There was nothing there anymore. Instead, I drove straight to the warehouse, where I stacked boxes and loaded shelves. The fluorescent lights made my eyes ache. The smell of cardboard, metal, and cleaning chemicals clung to my clothes. My coworkers talked around me, their voices sharp with gossip, and I caught snippets. "Can you believe she's still here?" one whispered. Another laughed quietly. "After all that, she's still working like nothing happened." I wanted to throw something, shout, tell them to mind their own business, but I just nodded silently and kept lifting boxes. Hours passed like dragging chains. My body felt heavier with every movement. My back ached. My hands were raw from gripping boxes, and my legs throbbed with fatigue. I felt the first warning signs of dizziness, but I ignored them. There was no pause button, no option to slow down. The bills were piling up, the rent was due, and I had no savings to fall back on. I didn't even have the luxury of breaking down properly. By the time I left the warehouse, it was already dark. The sky had turned a bruised purple, and the streetlights cast sharp, artificial shadows over the sidewalks. My last job of the day awaited, cleaning offices until midnight. My car radio played static, the voice of the late-night DJ lost in the hum of the engine. I didn't even notice. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the last few weeks, my parents leaving, the town turning against me, the whispers, the judging eyes, the empty rooms I had once called home. At the office, the fluorescent lights made me squint. The smell of disinfectant and carpet cleaner was suffocating. I pushed a mop across the floor, each stroke heavier than the last. My muscles burned. My eyes watered. And yet, I couldn't stop. The clients had been gone for hours, leaving everything for me to clean. Paper cups scattered, crumbs ground into the carpet, coffee stains baked into the counters. During a brief break, I sat on the floor against the wall, head in my hands. My body shook with exhaustion, but there was another layer: grief. Grief for the life I had expected, grief for the family that had vanished, grief for the town that had already judged me. It was relentless, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. A shadow fell across my knees. It was one of the cleaning supervisors, a man named Richard, older and gruff, but not unkind. "You okay, kid?" he asked. His tone was curious, but gentle. "You look like hell." I swallowed hard, shaking my head. "I'm fine," I lied. My voice was hoarse from exhaustion. He didn't press further, just nodded and walked away. But his glance lingered in my mind longer than I realized. He had seen the fatigue, seen the hollow in my eyes, and didn't dismiss it. He didn't need to. And in that moment, a tiny flicker of recognition passed through me. Someone had noticed. Someone outside my family, someone outside my small town, had seen the cost of everything I had been doing. When I finished that last shift, I walked to my car in the empty parking lot. The night was silent, the air cold against my skin. Every street light seemed to illuminate my exhaustion. Every shadow exaggerated my solitude. I drove to a small, cheap motel on the outskirts of town, my temporary refuge. I didn't have the energy or money for more. Inside, I collapsed onto the bed, fully clothed. My body was trembling, my heart pounding, and my stomach hollow. Sleep was impossible. My mind replayed the last week, the town staring at me, the rumors, the whispers, the cashier who avoided me, the neighbor who rolled her eyes, the kids at the daycare asking if I was okay, and the constant, gnawing thought, I am alone, completely and utterly alone. The next morning came too soon, dragging me back into the relentless rhythm. Another 4 jobs. Another day of running on empty, each day blurred into the next. Breakfast was a granola bar in the car. Lunch was a piece of fruit eaten standing up in a parking lot between shifts. Dinner was a cold sandwich while scanning invoices in a back office. There was no time for rest, no time for reflection, only survival. The physical toll was immense. My back ached constantly, muscles knotted. My hands were calloused and raw. My eyes burned from fluorescent lights and screen glare. My sleep cycles were non-existent. I fell asleep standing at the bus stop once, my head lolling forward as the cold morning air bit my cheeks. I woke to the sound of someone clearing their throat, a sharp reminder that the world didn't pause for my suffering. Mental exhaustion came next. Every interaction felt heavier. Every conversation a potential source of judgment. I couldn't escape the shadow of my parents' disappearance or the gossip of the town. Every small act of kindness toward me seemed suspicious. Every smile hidden beneath a forced laugh became a reminder of how isolated I had become. And yet, amidst all of this, there were tiny moments that pierced the darkness. A co-worker at the diner slipping me a free coffee when no one was looking. A child at the daycare leaving a crayon drawing on my desk with "You're the best" scribbled across it. Richard, the supervisor, giving me a nod of approval after I finished a particularly tough cleaning job. These small fragments of acknowledgement became lifelines, reminders that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't completely invisible. One afternoon at the warehouse, I felt it, my first real breakdown since everything had begun. I was stacking boxes when the world tilted. My arms refused to lift the next carton. My vision blurred. I stumbled, crashing into a stack of packages. My coworkers froze, watching. No one came to help. I wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, that I had been working myself to the point of collapse for a family that had abandoned me, for a town that judged me before hearing me, for a life I wasn't allowed to live. I just sank to the floor, head in my hands, silent tears sliding down my cheeks. For the first time in weeks, the facade cracked. The exhaustion, the betrayal, the isolation, they all hit me at once. And in that raw, shattering moment, I realized something. I couldn't keep going like this forever. Something had to give. But giving up wasn't an option. Not now. I had bills to pay. I had obligations. And buried deep beneath the grief and fatigue, there was a stubborn spark of determination. I had survived this long. I wasn't about to collapse completely. So I stood up, dusted off my uniform, and continued, one box at a time. One order at a time, one shift at a time, running on empty, but still moving forward. By the end of the week, my body felt like it had aged 10 years. My skin was pale, my hair limp, my hands calloused and raw. And yet, amidst the exhaustion, there was a quiet clarity. I had survived betrayal. I had survived judgment. I had survived working 4 jobs with no thanks, no recognition, and no love from the people I had sacrificed everything for. I was running on empty, yes, but I was still here, and that somehow felt like the first victory I had claimed in months. I didn't know it yet, but the moment I met him, everything was about to shift. I had just finished my last shift for the week, collapsing into my car in the dark parking lot outside the diner. My hands were still sticky from spilled coffee, my back a mess of knots, and my eyes burned from fluorescent lights and sleepless nights. I felt like I was barely holding myself together. Each heartbeat a reminder that I had been surviving but not living. The parking lot was empty except for a sleek black car parked 2 spaces down. A man stepped out, tall, older, dressed neatly but without any ostentation. His face was lined with subtle age, and his eyes, dark and steady, met mine as I fumbled to lock my car. I felt my chest tighten. Something about him was immediately different, not threatening, not judgmental, but sharp, observant, like he could see straight through me right to the frayed edges of who I had become. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice low, calm, and strangely comforting. I froze, unsure if I should respond. Usually, strangers made assumptions. Usually they judged. Usually they didn't care. But there was something in his tone, a gentle precision, that made me want to answer honestly, even though I rarely did. "Yeah," I admitted, finally, my voice cracking. "You could say that." He nodded as if he understood more than I could explain in words. "I've been watching people for a long time," he said, with a small, enigmatic smile. "Sometimes the ones carrying the heaviest loads don't even realize how visible they are." I blinked, confused. I wanted to dismiss him, to tell him he didn't know me, didn't know what I had been through. But the exhaustion in my body and the raw ache in my heart made me pause. Instead, I leaned against my car, silent, letting him speak. "My name is Lawson," he said, holding out a hand. There was something steady in his grip when I shook it, a quiet confidence that didn't feel overpowering, just grounding. "And you are?" "Savannah," I replied cautiously. My lips were dry, my throat tight. "Savannah Collins." "Collins," he repeated thoughtfully, almost as if tasting the name. "You've been through a lot, Savannah, but you're still standing. That's remarkable." Remarkable. The word made me wince. To him, maybe it sounded like praise, but to me, it was a reminder of every hour, every dollar, every sleepless night I had endured. I wanted to snap back. Remarkable? I'm exhausted. I'm invisible. I'm alone. But instead, I just nodded. He didn't press further that night. We spoke in small, careful exchanges. Weather, the diner closing, the long drives home, but every sentence carried subtle observation, as though he was piecing together fragments of my life without forcing me to explain. I found myself talking more than I intended, telling him the minor, mundane details of my day. I didn't know why, but it felt safe, like he wouldn't twist my words, like he wouldn't judge the exhaustion etched across my face. By the second meeting, which happened a few nights later at the same parking lot, he began to ask more pointed questions. "Do you sleep much?" he asked, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "Do you eat properly? Are you safe?" I laughed bitterly, brushing at my hoodie. "Safe? Not really. Eat properly? Rarely. Sleep? What's that?" He chuckled softly, not mockingly, but in a way that made me want to lean closer, to listen more. "You're pushing yourself too far," he said. "And for what? A family that doesn't appreciate you. A town that's already judged you." The words cut sharper than I expected. How did he know? I hadn't told him about my parents or the lottery. I hadn't told him about the town, the whispers, the exhaustion. And yet he knew. Somehow he knew. I don't know any other way," I said quietly. My voice trembled, not from fear, but from years of holding everything in. If I stop, everything falls apart. I've worked 4 jobs just to survive, to keep up. His gaze softened. "I see that," he said, and then, unexpectedly, he handed me a cup of coffee from the car's cup holder. Not a Starbucks cup, not a cheap convenience store cup. This was hot, aromatic, comforting. "Take a moment. Sit. Drink. Let yourself breathe. Just for a few minutes." I hesitated, then accepted it. I sipped, and the warmth spread slowly through me, more than the liquid. It was the gesture, the acknowledgement, the recognition that someone saw the weight I was carrying. From that night, things shifted. Lawson didn't try to fix my problems. He didn't offer money or advice or sympathy. He just observed, listened, and occasionally nudged me toward clarity. It was the first time in months I felt seen, not for what I did for others, not for what I had lost, but for who I was. We began meeting more frequently, sometimes in the parking lot after my shifts, sometimes in the corner booth of a 24-hour diner. Late at night when the world felt quiet, he asked about my work, but he also asked about me, the parts one had forgotten existed. What I enjoyed, what scared me, what I wanted when I allowed myself to dream. One night, I found myself telling him about my parents' disappearance, the empty house, the voicemail, the town turning against me. I hadn't told anyone else. Not a friend, not a coworker, not even Tommy. Yet there I was, words spilling out like a dam breaking. Lawson listened without interruption. No judgment. No reaction that made me feel small. Just attentive, steady, patient. "You've been carrying an impossible load," he said finally when I had finished. "And no one, not your parents, not your town, has ever deserved that. Not you. Not even a little." His words hit me differently than anything else I had heard. Not pity, not validation, not empty platitudes, just understanding. Over the next few weeks, our connection deepened. He began noticing patterns in my life I hadn't consciously recognized. How my body tensed when I thought about home. How my eyes darted when someone whispered behind my back. How I carried exhaustion in my gait. My shoulders slouched like armor against the world. He didn't offer solutions. He simply pointed things out gently, letting me come to my own realizations. One evening, he surprised me by inviting me into his home. It wasn't large or ostentatious. It was simple, tidy, filled with books and the faint scent of old wood. A quiet, warm space that felt safe. "You need to see that there's more outside the struggle," he said. "You deserve to rest. You deserve clarity. Not everything is as dark as it feels." I hesitated at first, but something inside me, some thread of trust, some instinct told me to accept. Inside, the quiet comfort of his home wrapped around me. I didn't realize how desperately I had needed that until I sank into the couch, letting my body relax for the first time in months. He didn't pry, didn't demand, didn't push. He simply made coffee, slid it across the table, and said, "Tell me what's really going on. Every detail, every fear, every exhaustion." And so I did. I told him about the 4 jobs, about the physical toll, about the emotional drain, about the nights I cried alone on my motel bed. I told him about the whispers, the judgment, the feeling of being erased. I told him how it felt to work tirelessly for people who had left me without a backward glance. He listened, and he remembered. When I finished, I felt lighter, though the exhaustion remained. "You're stronger than you know," he said, "stronger than anyone else can measure. But strength doesn't mean ignoring yourself. It doesn't mean endless sacrifice. Strength is also knowing when to stand still, to let yourself breathe, and to see the truth clearly." It was the first time someone reframed strength for me. Not as endurance through suffering alone, not as silent sacrifice, but as clarity, self-awareness, and courage. Over the next month, Lawson began helping me navigate my life in subtle, unexpected ways. He didn't hand me money. He didn't take over my problems. He helped me identify opportunities, moments of leverage, small openings I hadn't noticed. He introduced me to contacts for work that paid more fairly without exploitation. He helped me document what had happened with my parents, guiding me to gather evidence safely and carefully. One rainy evening, as we sat across from each other in his kitchen, he placed a hand on the table. "Savannah," he said quietly, "the world has tried to erase you. Your family has tried to erase you, but they can't erase what you carry inside. They can't erase your resilience. And if you let me, I'll help you make sure the truth gets seen, not for revenge, but for clarity and for you." I looked at him, hesitant, unsure. Part of me feared trust again. Part of me feared hope. And part of me, just a small, stubborn part, wanted to believe that maybe, finally, someone genuinely saw me. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of something I thought I had lost forever. Possibility. After months of running on empty, of being unseen, of working 4 jobs to keep my life afloat, a small spark of possibility had finally taken root inside me. Lawson's presence had been like a gentle, steady flame, cutting through the fog of exhaustion and betrayal. I still carried fatigue in every muscle, every joint, every thought, but for the first time in what felt like years, I could imagine something more, a life where I was visible, acknowledged, and capable of choosing my path instead of merely surviving it. It started with small steps. Lawson encouraged me to document everything, not just for clarity, but to reclaim the narrative of my life. I began compiling records, receipts, pay stubs, and journal entries from the past few years, proof of every hour I had worked, every sacrifice I had made. I wanted the world to see the truth, not for vengeance, but to honor the years of silent struggle no one had acknowledged. One rainy afternoon, I spread the papers across the small table in his kitchen. The smell of wet earth and coffee mingled as I sorted them, my fingers trembling from both exhaustion and excitement. "It's all here," I said, mostly to myself. Every single thing I did for them, for everything I tried to hold together. Lawson leaned over, eyes scanning the piles. "It's more than enough," he said. "You've built a mountain out of your own sweat and determination. And now it's time for the world to recognize it." Recognition was tricky. I wasn't naive enough to believe it would erase the judgment of the town or fix the betrayal I felt from my parents. But at least I could reclaim control over my own story. That night, we created a plan, a careful, deliberate approach. We wouldn't fight fire with fire. We wouldn't feed the gossip. We would present the truth in a way that was undeniable, logical, and measured. It took weeks. I juggled my remaining jobs while meeting Lawson in the evenings, gathering evidence, making calls, and quietly preparing to face a world that had written me out. Each day was exhausting, but I felt stronger than before because for the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was acting. I was reclaiming agency. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning. I received an email from a legal advisor Lawson had connected me with, a small, compassionate woman who specialized in family and financial disputes. Her words were direct but gentle. "Savannah, you have a clear case to assert your rights and uncover the truth. You are not alone in this. Let's take the first step together." I stared at the screen for a long time, my hands shaking. The idea of confronting my parents, of challenging the lottery windfall, and the betrayal terrified me, but it also invigorated me. All those nights I had cried alone on the motel bed. All those mornings I had dragged myself out of a bed I barely owned. All those shifts that left my body aching. I had done it for myself, too. And now I could finally act for myself. The next day, I went to the local courthouse. The building smelled of polished wood, cleaning products, and faint hints of stale coffee. I waited nervously in the lobby, papers clutched tightly in my hands, my stomach twisting into knots. I had rehearsed this in my mind 1,000 times, but reality was always sharper, more intimidating. Lawson was beside me, calm and reassuring. "You're ready," he said. "You've already done the hard part, surviving. This is just the next step." I nodded, swallowing hard. I stepped into the courtroom with a mixture of fear and determination. When my parents arrived, the sight of them, smiling, comfortable, unaware of the storm their actions had caused, made my chest tighten. They didn't recognize the exhaustion etched on my face, the resilience that had been forged in silence, the weight I had carried alone. "Savannah," my mother said, her voice tentative. We didn't mean to..." But I held up a hand. "Don't," I said softly but firmly. "I'm not here for excuses. I'm here for the truth." The proceedings were long and meticulous. Every document I had gathered, every proof of my labor, every financial record, and every correspondence was laid out. Lawson and the advisor guided me, whispering clarifications when necessary. I spoke when required, my voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. I told my story, not with anger, not with blame, but with facts. By the end of the day, I felt a sense of release I hadn't expected. It wasn't a victory yet, not entirely, but it was a tangible step toward justice, toward reclaiming my life. And more importantly, it was acknowledgement. The world had seen me. The truth had been heard. Over the next few weeks, the town's whispers began to shift. Slowly, cautiously, people started to understand. Not everyone was supportive, of course. Some still gossiped, some still judged. But there were also those who recognized the effort, the labor, the perseverance. A few neighbors who had avoided me before came forward to apologize quietly. A couple of coworkers brought small notes of encouragement. It wasn't sweeping recognition, but it was real and it was mine. And then came the moment that would change everything. A local journalist, intrigued by the story of the lottery-winning parents and their estranged daughter, reached out. Lawson encouraged me to speak, to tell my story honestly. I was hesitant, terrified, but I knew this was my chance to reclaim my narrative fully. The interview was intense. I spoke about the years I had worked multiple jobs, about the exhaustion, about the betrayal, and about the small victories that had kept me alive. I didn't embellish. I didn't exaggerate. I spoke plainly, honestly, and with raw emotion. When it was published, the response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from strangers who had faced similar struggles, from people who understood what it meant to be invisible while giving everything. The validation was more profound than I had expected. It wasn't long after that my parents reached out, tentatively at first, and then more insistently. They apologized, their words clumsy but sincere. They admitted they hadn't understood the impact of their actions, hadn't realized the weight they had left me to bear alone. I listened, but I didn't immediately forgive. Forgiveness, I realized, was a choice I would make on my terms, not under pressure. Lawson continued to guide me, not as a savior, but as a steady presence. He reminded me that my life was mine to shape, that the past didn't define the future, and that choosing myself wasn't selfish. It was necessary. In the months that followed, I made deliberate choices. I left the most grueling of my jobs, keeping only those that provided stability without breaking me. I enrolled in classes I had postponed for years, pursuing a field I had always been curious about but never had time for. I reconnected with friends who genuinely cared, who had waited patiently and never judged. And most importantly, I started setting boundaries with my parents. They could be part of my life, but not at the cost of my well-being. I didn't need their approval, and I didn't need their validation. I had built myself from the ground up, brick by brick, and I was finally able to step into a life that reflected my own choices. One quiet evening, sitting in my small apartment with sunlight filtering through the blinds, I reflected on the journey, the townspeople who had turned their backs, the parents who had betrayed, the endless shifts that had drained me. Each chapter had shaped me, yes, but it hadn't destroyed me. I had survived, yes, but I had also reclaimed, rebuilt, and redefined myself. Lawson stopped by that evening with his usual calm presence. We sat quietly on the couch, sipping tea. I looked at him and smiled. I never thought I'd get here. I said softly, "Not after everything." "You did," he replied. "You just didn't realize it yet. You've always been stronger than anyone gave you credit for, including yourself." For the first time in years, I believed it. The exhaustion hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had transformed from a burden into proof of endurance, from despair into clarity. I had chosen a life not dictated by betrayal, judgment, or circumstance. I had chosen a life defined by my own decisions, my own strength, and my own vision of happiness. And in that choice, I found freedom. The truth had been revealed. The breakthrough had arrived. And the life I had chosen, my life, was finally mine. The sun was setting outside my apartment window, spilling gold across the floor and catching in the dust motes that danced lazily in the warm air. I leaned back against the couch, a cup of tea cradled in my hands, and let myself breathe. For the first time in years, I felt the weight I had carried for so long ease, just enough to let me notice the quiet strength that had grown inside me while no one was watching. Every ache in my body, every sleepless night, every shift that left me trembling, they hadn't broken me, they had built me. I realized then that the life I had chosen wasn't defined by money, by approval, or even by survival. It was defined by me, by the choices I made, the boundaries I set, the courage I found in the darkest hours, and the clarity I had gained from seeing the truth, facing it, and refusing to let it dictate who I was going to become. Lawson sat across from me, quietly reading a book, but I knew he was listening, attentive as always. He had been a stranger who saw through all the masks I had worn for the world, through the exhaustion, the grief, the resentment, and never judged me. He had only helped me notice the fire that still burned inside me, even when I thought it had flickered out completely. And now, as I sat here, I understood that fire was mine to carry wherever I chose, not for anyone else. Not for anyone who had abandoned me or doubted me, but for myself. I thought of my parents, their absence, their betrayal, their lottery win, and I felt a flicker of anger. Yes, but it no longer consumed me. I didn't need them to validate my life, to acknowledge my struggles, or to apologize in a way that I could forgive them entirely. My worth wasn't tied to their recognition. My strength wasn't dependent on their approval. I had proven to myself that I could survive everything they had left behind, and more importantly, that I could thrive on my own terms. The town, the whispers, the judgment, they no longer held power over me. They were echoes of a past I had already moved beyond. Looking forward, I felt a mix of anticipation and quiet determination. There were challenges ahead, of course. Life wasn't suddenly simple, but I had the tools, the resilience, and the clarity to face them. I had built a foundation out of struggle, heartbreak, and relentless perseverance, and that foundation was unshakable. Every choice from this point onward would be mine. I would work, yes, but not to survive alone. I would love, yes, but cautiously, and on terms that protected me. I would dream boldly and pursue those dreams without fear of judgment. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be free, not the absence of struggle, but the presence of self. The life I chose was no longer about running on empty, about invisible labor, about earning love or recognition. It was about seeing myself clearly, honoring my journey, and stepping forward with intention. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in colors that felt like promise and possibility. I sipped my tea and let myself smile. Genuinely, finally, this was my life, my truth, my choice. And nothing, no betrayal, no exhaustion, no loss could ever take that away from me again.